Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Avoid Pitfalls When Planning for an FDA Submission. My name is Alicia Bond, and I am honored to be today's moderator for our panel of experts who are here to discuss their real-world experiences and best practices related to the topic. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and start introducing our expert panel. And I'd like to start with Shauna Monterey. Thank you so much for joining, Shauna.
Thank you.
We are thrilled to have you here. Shauna is the CEO and founder of Beanstalk Ventures. With over 20 years of experience in medical device development, Shauna has a remarkable track record in guiding innovative products to market. Her commitment to advancing medical devices, life sciences, and biotechnology led her to establish Beanstalk Ventures, where she continues to make a significant impact on healthcare product delivery. Beanstalk is one of only 7 FDA-accredited third-party review organizations globally. So we're thrilled to have you join us, Shauna.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce Mirko Reiner. I don't know if I said that right, but I did my best, Mirko.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you with us. Mirko is the founder of Fava Development, and he is also a technology leader who's passionate about medical device development and innovation. Mirko brings a very unique perspective with his experience on both sides of the FDA 510(k) process, including having served as a contract software and cybersecurity reviewer for the FDA. So thanks again for joining us, Mirko.
Happy to be here.
And finally, I am honored to introduce you to Ken Zalewski, who is our CEO and founder at Vigilant Ops. Ken is a distinguished cybersecurity expert who has collaborated with top government agencies such as the FDA and the Department of Homeland Security on key cybersecurity initiatives. With his extensive experience and deep knowledge, Ken has been a prominent voice in the industry, advising medical device manufacturers and healthcare providers on best practices to not only successfully launch secure, innovative products, but to also enhance their overall cybersecurity posture. So thank you, Ken, and thank you to Vigilant Ops for hosting this webinar.
Thank you, Alicia, and it's great to be here with these 2 distinguished guests. We're looking forward to a great webinar. I know there'll be lots of good information shared today, so thank you very much and welcome, everyone.
Excellent, excellent. So I wanted to let the audience know that we are recording today's session, so it will be made available to you via replay. And I also wanted to offer that we have several topics to discuss today, but if you do have questions you'd like to submit to the panel, we will do our very best to address those as well. So you can click on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions that you might have. And again, we'll do our best to get to those. So excited to start this discussion, everyone. So I guess I'd like to start with eSTAR. So, we probably have audience members who may not be as familiar with eSTAR. So we'd love to hear a little bit about, what is it? And then for the audience members who already know about eSTAR, really what's changed? What's new? And Shauna, I was wondering if you could kick this off for us.
Yeah, sure. So cybersecurity has been around for a while, so it's not a new topic. But recently, as we all know, FDA went through a huge revamp, especially for the pre-market submission requirements. And so as part of that revamp, and it's kind of unrelated, but just in terms of timing, there was a new initiative kicked off as well, which is like a digital submission process. So it's called the eSTAR. So prior to that, you would submit, through even like shipping physical paper, and now everything's electronic. So that got rolled out October 2023. When it got rolled out, cybersecurity guidance was already published and released. And basically what was there in the original eSTAR submission, which is now a requirement, was 2 cybersecurity requirements. So it was really around risk management. So it was the risk management and then cybersecurity management, which is a post-market surveillance program. So that was it. And then what ended up happening is a lot of the submissions that were coming in were getting kicked back for deficiencies. And the eSTAR didn't call these out specifically for cybersecurity, hence they weren't being submitted or provided. And so now FDA went and kind of overhauled the eSTAR primarily with the cybersecurity section. So now there's 11 distinct items. And I'll just kind of list them off. I don't have them memorized, but we have the risk report, threat model, risk assessment, SBOM, a list of unresolved anomalies, cybersecurity metrics, cybersecurity controls, architectural views, testing, labeling, and cyber management plan. So it's quite a bit. And what's happening is if you don't submit everything on the list, you're going to get immediately rejected. They're not even going to review your submission. So what it's called is a RTA, and it's called refuse to accept. And so if the eSTAR isn't complete and the validation in that eSTAR form doesn't pass, you're going to get rejected immediately.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Anything to add? Any additional commentary, Mirko, or? I think you're on
No, I
mute.
think Shauna summarized it pretty well.
Awesome. Well, Mirko, since I'm speaking to you directly anyway, maybe would you mind explaining some of the key cybersecurity requirements that have been set by FDA for medical device manufacturers and for the devices that they're looking for approval on, and what, you know, what are these specific requirements and why they're so critical?
Yeah, sure. So like the whole cybersecurity initiative that the FDA has been kind of following for the past couple of years. It all started with the Section 524B in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and so the first guidance that came out on this topic came out in March 2023. Which was basically just like only a 6-page guidance that pretty much summarized the FDNC 524B Act, very short guidance. So that had actually a very generous kind of 6-month implementation frame. But before that even kind of finished, the finalized updated cybersecurity guidance came out in September of 2023. And yeah, the important part here is that the FDNC 524B has a definition of cyber device that is actually very broad, and it might surprise people that it includes a lot of devices that you might not necessarily think of cyber devices, right? So the 3 criteria that 524B kind of sets out is that it has to be a device that is kind of a digital device that's kind of running software. It can potentially connect to the internet, and it can be vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks. And as they can potentially connect to the internet, the definition is really so broad that if you somehow manage to make that device connect to the internet, that basically counts, right? So for instance, if you have an Ethernet port, even though you may not necessarily have like a TCP/IP protocol stack running, just that Ethernet port, that makes it a cyber device. Even a USB port, unless you can prove that you're only using it for charging, that is something that could potentially carry, again, like an internet connection. So it's very narrow, and it's really important to kind of realize this, that a lot of devices fall under this definition. The requirements that it puts out are basically, so like the main requirement is you have to kind of demonstrate reasonable assurance of cybersecurity. And that is very broad, but the FDA cybersecurity guidance talks more in detail about what that specifically means. But it really applies for all devices in the 510K or other pre-market processes. And even if you have like a device that you've had previously on the market, that maybe not much changed in terms of cybersecurity, you will now have to submit like a full cybersecurity assessment for that. Another item is, as Shauna already said, there's like a post-market monitoring. So you have to provide your plan, how you want to monitor, identify, and address post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Also, there is a requirement to provide a software bill of materials. And that in turn should be used, to kind of like check your device software for vulnerabilities. So yeah, it's a whole new program, and I would say the FDA is definitely kind of like really focused on this and kind of tightening the screws in this area.
Yeah, and I'll just add on, it is a new emphasis for the FDAs, and it's very stringent, and it's also very technical, which is quite interesting. So they're looking at the technical aspects of your device. I mean, they're going to dig into the architecture, your risk controls, any sort of exposed interfaces, as Mirko mentioned, regardless if they're being used or not. The other thing that's important to note is that this is kind of, I've seen this trend before when usability came out way back, I don't know, in 2006 or 9 or somewhere around there some time ago. It was a very strong focus, and there was no distinction from one device to the next. Like, everyone needed to do a usability study, and now that's changed. And so I'm hoping to see something very similar with cyber. Now, right now it's applied to all, but you can see in the software guidance that there's some stratification. It used to be based on level concern. Now it's a documentation level. So they have an enhanced and a basic documentation level. Perhaps in the future, we can see some stratification. But I think what is important right now to note is that there is none, and there's no rules defined around that. And so your best chance to getting your device clear and reducing the back and forth that you have with the FDA, or eliminating the risk of having a refuse to accept or straight rejection of your submission, is just to complete every item, even if it's basic information and maybe it's not as detailed because it just doesn't apply. Just making sure that you explain that why your device does not apply in this particular area, and then defend the position for basically not providing some of the content in some other form of description.
Yeah, that was great. Mirko laying out the details, and then Shauna following up with some practical advice. I would also like to add, I mean, I think that one of the things that I find pretty unique about the situation we're in today with FDA with respect to guidance documents and requirements is, as Mirko pointed out, they're kind of mixing post-market and pre-market stuff together in the pre-market submission. And what I mean by that is, you look at a pre-market plan, and now you've, as a device manufacturer, need to be thinking ahead as to how you're going to support that device in the field and provide that plan to FDA, right? So gone are those days where you say, we'll patch, and we'll patch on the number of days that we can get to you, so to speak. Now FDA's got really stringent requirements around that. So even, to Shauna's point, you got to be thinking ahead. You got to be planning and looking toward, once the device is fielded, how do you support it when it's out there? And FDA is really going to scrutinize those plans and make sure that you can react and respond in the timeframes that they've specified. So I think that's also fairly unique with the situation we're in, is kind of this mix of pre and post monitoring.
That is new.
That's interesting, as is the comment, Mirko, you made, that the definition of a cyber device doesn't mean it does connect. It means it can connect, right? One of the elements that you mentioned is one I think that people have been surprised by, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that is one of the key points that makes it such a broad definition, right? It does not necessarily kind of like have to connect, as part of the normal device operation, just, the potential, if it could.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it almost includes every device we've ever seen, right? With
It's
the exception of purely mechanical devices.
right. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, so, and Shauna, you were mentioning kind of the breadth and depth of information that, you should try to answer as much, even if it doesn't apply, right? So kind of that leads me to another question I had, which was, what are some of the most common mistakes or oversights that you're seeing in these submissions that medical device manufacturers might be making?
Sure. So we're in an interesting position because we do the third-party reviews, but we also provide consulting. So a lot of customers come to us, they see us on the website that we're a third-party review organization, and they have deficiencies. And what we're seeing, we're not going to focus on, anything outside of cyber, but we're seeing two main deficiency focused areas, which is artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. So with cybersecurity, these are kind of the trends. It might change over time, but this is what we're seeing currently. One in particular is, in your risk analysis, you're usually using two factors. You're using probability of occurrence and severity of the harm. You're using those two to kind of assess your risk benefit. What's happening now is people are using that to apply that to the cybersecurity potential vulnerabilities or threats, if you want to refer to them as such. And it doesn't account for the actual risk because the probability is very hard to assess. And so what FDA is looking for is using exploitability, but also assessing the severity of the harm as well. And if you look at it just from that lens, that's patient harm. But then Mirko, you can talk a little bit about this when you get a chance. But I think what Mirko was alluding to in previous conversation was that they're also concerned with impacting other systems that may not be patient harm necessarily. It could be data breach and just bringing down a whole network, that type of thing. The other area would be the architectural views. So architectural views, I think they're requiring 3 or 4. They're looking at like a real big overview of the system, security use cases, your patchability and whatnot. And those views are being determined as a must-have because it's hard for the FDA reviewer to assess your product technically and to determine if your threat analysis, your risk analysis was complete. So even if you don't feel, you think your product's very simple, they do need to have that input so they can do an appropriate review. So it's not kind of done blindly or just looking at the risk that you've laid out. They're actually looking at your product and analyzing it as well. And so that's a little bit different than other submissions. Threat model, they're looking for a threat model. The rigor behind the threat model is going to be really important. That's like a brainstorming activity to kind of brainstorm all the potential vulnerabilities. They want to see that as input. So similar if you're doing a risk analysis and you're doing fault trees, it's kind of equivalent to that. It's a little bit different, but there's a good playbook for that, MITRE's playbook on how to do threat modeling. Vulnerability assessment, third-party software. So with the SBOM that we talked about, you need to list all your third-party software, including your operating system, and you need to monitor it for vulnerabilities. And that's usually a gap. And you also need to do a risk analysis around those vulnerabilities and have some sort of action plan in place. Other big one is, gosh, I have a couple more. I won't take up all the time. But another big one is not considering, there's a section in the guidance called security control categories, and there's 8 of them. Those categories include authentication, authorization, cryptography, etc. Those 8 you need to consider. And even if it doesn't apply, I would just list it out and say, we've evaluated our product doesn't use any cryptography, any encryption mechanism, right? And this is why. So you want to make sure that you cover those so it's not being overlooked. So if it's something that's NA, please just provide a description so that FDA doesn't think it's a gap, because they're not going to know, right? You know your product better than they do. End of life, end of support plan. So if you're using end of life operating system or software, that's a big one right now. And then the level of support needed for your product. So those are the main ones. I know it's quite a lot, but it's really in those core focus areas. And then Mirko, he's been a reviewer for some time now, specifically to cyber, and he might have some additional insights as a reviewer, what he's looking for and where the gaps are.
Yeah, I can share some best practices definitely, and kind of strategies for preparing the cybersecurity part of your submission, you know, so that hopefully it won't come back with deficiencies. So the one thing I want to reiterate, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes, you know, like, you know, I've seen at the FDA is that companies assume their device is not a cyber device, and they will just not submit any cybersecurity documentation or like a single page that says not applicable. So make really sure, you know, it's possible that your device is not a cyber device, but it is in this day and age, if it's a software-based device, it's very unlikely. The other thing is make sure, you know, to reiterate what Shauna said earlier, make sure that your documentation is complete, and Appendix 4 of the cybersecurity guidance is you know, a tabular presentation of all the items that you need. Shauna listed them all earlier. It's about 10 or 11 items.
Yes.
Make sure, you know, all of these items are covered. And even if it's just like a very short thing saying, okay, you know, we only have like, you know, these 3 attack vectors, and this is how we're dealing with it. Regarding the architectural views, make sure that they're sufficiently detailed, right? A common thing, that I've seen, like, reviewing cybersecurity submission is that it has like, a bunch of details, like what's going on inside of the device. And then there's like an arrow that points, to a cloud, on this internet. And yeah, I'm not kidding, and this may be good, for like, a non-technical sort of like context. But you really have to kind of keep in mind, it's not really directly the internet, you in between there is the hospital network or the home network, for medical devices that the users are using at home, right? So you're basically vulnerable, to attacks that are coming from the hospital network or from the home network, right? Maybe the person's a router got hacked, right? Or maybe there's already something else going on the hospital network. So make sure that it's really detailed enough and has really all the players kind of broken down in there. That's kind of another thing, that I would recommend. With regards to the SBOM, and I think Ken probably can talk about that in a little bit more detail. Basically, putting together an SBOM for like any even moderately complex cybersecurity device manually is very, very difficult, right? And a common problem, that we would see at the FDA is that, for instance, only the primary dependencies are listed, right? So it says like, oh, we're using like this open source software package and that. And this is our SBOM, right? The SBOM really should include all direct and transitive dependencies, right? And these are like often like huge trees of software, that's literally included in your device, right? And many developers don't think about that. All the kind of like the massive amount of third-party software that they're depending on. So yeah, I'll leave it to Ken to kind of talk a little bit more about that. But make sure your SBOM is really complete. And frankly, there's plenty of tools out there to produce an SBOM that that has really everything that it needs to have. Yeah, final kind of best practice thing that I wanted to talk about is the penetration test, right? And the agency really highly recommends the penetration test to be done by an external company that has experience in that. So like, I think it's oftentimes hard for medical device manufacturers to admit that, like, hey, our expertise is medical devices. We're not cybersecurity experts, right? And really make sure to kind of like have like a third-party company that has the right expertise with that. It's very difficult, and it's a whole separate skill set, that you would not, expect in a, medical device, engineer. You would not expect that necessarily just in a general software engineer.
Mhm.
Yeah, so those are kind of like some of the kind of best practices. Also, one thing, don't reinvent the wheel, right? So use existing methodologies, right? So basically, if you say, okay, for your threat modeling, we're using STRIDE and attack trees, that will be fine, right? For the scoring of your risk assessment, if you're using CBSS, that will be totally fine. So the agency will accept that and will actually prefer that. And it's much easier, to just reuse these existing well-established methodologies rather than saying like, yeah, we kind of developed our own formula here, and this is kind of how we do it. Very likely the agency will come back and will say like, well, can you kind of prove that this really makes sense? So rely on standard established methodologies whenever possible. So yeah, Ken, I don't know, maybe you can talk about the SBOM a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Mirko. I'd be happy to. So yeah, as everyone knows, probably Vigilant Ops, right? We provide an automated solution around SBOM management. So we've been looking at that problem for quite some time, and the complexity that you mentioned is right on the money. There are tools out there today that can create SBOMs or generate SBOMs. Some of them don't get to that dependency level that you talked about, Mirko, and that's really important to understand, because you've got components buried in the software, maybe even developers aren't aware of. And so tracing those through from a dependency perspective is something you should expect of your tool. And then tracking those as you go forward has to be automatic or at least automated in some form or fashion, because it's impossible, nearly impossible, to keep up with vulnerabilities and especially with the number of components and the vulnerabilities hitting on a continuous basis. So yeah, I mean, whatever you can do to automate that piece of it, you should really look at doing. The other thing I'd like to pull up, separate from SML, but part of it, I guess a piece of that same thing, is the point that Shauna made with a couple of pieces of information that are being required. And we're seeing a lot today from customers, excuse me, in this space that are being requested for end of life, end of support information. And FDA is pushing back pretty hard on that currently. And we know that's part of the eSTAR. We know it's not an official requirement of the guidance, but that seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. FDA is looking for that information from manufacturers. I wonder if either one of you have comments on that, and what do you think that disparity, or do you think that'll align, and will that make its way into official requirement at some point?
Shauna or Mirko?
I don't know. Honestly, it's hard to kind of to comment on like FDA's kind of future stance kind of on anything. I can only give like some general advice, like, I mean, for instance, there's like a draft guidance, that augments the cybersecurity guidance, like with regards to kind of like 524B. So that's not finalized yet, but so like the draft guidances are probably like the best thing, that you can get in terms of like, in general, finding out about like, the FDA's future thinking. But yeah, it's generally, it's hard, and as Shauna has said earlier, like it comes and goes in waves, right? I mean, there is things where like, like the just the workload at the FDA, will force them to kind of like focus less on certain things. So yeah, I don't know. It's maybe Shauna, you have a better insight on this.
We may have lost
You know
you.
what? I'm going to actually jump ahead. We'll come back to that when we get Shauna back. So
Sure.
it's interesting. Unless Shauna, did you want to interact want to comment to his question now?
I can, yeah. Sorry for the interruption.
No
So I was thinking there's a question here in the chat kind of related. I won't answer it directly, but talking about like other standards that are kind of upcoming. That's not the direct question. FDA has a link on their website that you can look for recognized consensus standards. So there's a few that are recognized by the FDA, but not all of them. So what's interesting is there's that 2071 or some number like that for ISO that's being used in EU very heavily, and it's very rigorous, and I think it's very nicely done. That's not yet a recognized consensus standard for the FDA. And so what I would recommend is, as you're moving forward, is to look to see if there's any new recognized consensus standards that you're already following that are up and coming that FDA is now adopting, because that'll make it easier for you to comply, right? Because if they're recognizing a standard, you can use that in lieu of some of the other requests that they have. And I know for EU, there's a lot of progress on cybersecurity, and we're seeing a lot of rigor there. But because they're moving from EU to FDA, and FDA hasn't recognized that yet, there's additional stuff that they actually need to do. So I know I didn't answer it directly, but just kind of start thinking ahead on how things might change outside of the guidance.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. Oh, Ken, did you have something to add?
No, I was going to say that's a great point, and I agree with you both. I mean, it's difficult to predict where things are going, and thank you for the good feedback there.
Awesome. So we're getting several questions, so bear with us. We're actually, some of them are overlapping with some of the questions we already had kind of prepared. One of them with relation to, there have been, just so everyone knows, the panelists know, there have been several questions about tools. Can you tell us more about the tools that might be available to help us automate this? Is there something that could be like a single pane of glass to help manage these types of things? And so I wanted to ask, actually, Ken, if you wouldn't mind taking this question, are there tools or resources or training or templates that might help to streamline what's required for the submission and the submission itself? So maybe start with you, if you don't mind, Ken.
Yeah, sure. No, I don't mind. Well, so, first and foremost, take a look at the guidance documents, right? FDA, I think it's been mentioned a couple of times, but the FDA pre-market guidance, and there's a long title for that, but it's like content of medical device, cybersecurity submission requirements or something, but it's everybody refers to it as the pre-market guidance. And then the post-market guidance has been out for a few years now. So take a look at that as well as just a couple of groundings in what FDA is requiring, of course. There are frameworks that you can look at. TIR 97 is a good framework to look at with respect to risk assessment. Amy's got some training out there. I think Shauna brought up a couple good points. Threat modeling is maybe new for a lot of folks. And I know there's some training out there that's available to help you do the threat modeling. And I know it's taken pretty seriously by FDA. So maybe something you want to look at. And I think FDA even had a workshop on threat modeling, and maybe they'll have another one. So that's something to keep an eye on. There are other frameworks out there. Shauna mentioned a couple of ISO documents, 27001. There's 14791, I think is, or 14097, or I'm losing the number now. Geez, number goes right. But the bottom line is there are a couple of ISO documents to look at for risk framework to understand the assessment, kind of pull that in a little better, frame it up with what you have currently. I know one of the things that I always recommend to customers too is medical device manufacturers are very, very familiar with safety. That they've built their entire process, procedure. They're really, the company's based on making their product safe, right? And I think if you can align that in some way with security and kind of hang a lot of what's happening on a security perspective, you may be able to reuse some procedures and look through what you're doing on the safety side, because a lot of that rigor still applies to security. Now, there's a lot of differences, but you start there with the framework you have, and you may be able to expand and extend on that. So I think somebody said, and maybe Mirko, don't reinvent the wheel. Kind of look back at what you have currently, process procedures in place, already supporting you in a safety mechanism. Look at that from a security perspective. And I'll stop there and let the others, I'm sure they have some comments as well.
You know, actually, Ken, I might actually ask you to expand, because as I look at this question, that was all awesome information and great tools to refer to. The one question that is being asked that kind of ties into that as well is from a little bit of a different perspective. So they're kind of asking, is there a platform that addresses the numerous cybersecurity requirements in a single pane of glass? So, while these webinars are not intended to be sales-y, there are tools out there. I don't know if, Ken, you just want to do a super high level on what Vigilant offers. And then if anyone wants to follow up with us, they certainly can, but I want to make sure we keep this informative. It's not a sales, presentation, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, and I'll keep it on the educational side. But so just start with saying Vigilant offers a platform that takes it from generation all the way through to consumption. So suffice to say, we satisfy the automation aspects of vulnerability monitoring, planning, compliance with FDA. We're really focused on medtech. I mean, that's my background. I come from medtech. I understand from a medical device perspective what you need to do. So that out of the way. There are tools out there that you can use, and if you look at generation of SBOM as kind of step one, there are open source tools that you can download. There's some good ones out there too. Trivy is a good example of an open source tool that I know folks have had good results with, that look at multiple ecosystems to generate SBOMs, and now they're standard formats. Folks on the call probably have heard of SPDX and CycloneDX. Those are kind of the popular standards you hear about today. CycloneDX a little bit more so than SPDX, but the tools you want to look at would be ones that can generate SBOMs in those formats. I think Alicia also pointed out, or somebody pointed out, the requirements of FDA sometimes vary a little bit with respect to how they want to ingest the SBOM. So we've heard customers say FDA has asked us for machine readable SBOMs, and that can be in either one of those formats, SPDX or CycloneDX. But by the same token, they've asked for human readable, right? And so that's probably going to be a PDF. Right. And so if you're looking at tools, you should also make sure you can export an SBOM in that human readable, because you probably will be asked that as well. So, by and large, on the generation side, I think you can find stuff there. I think where you find the gap mainly is really kind of getting that information, as I mentioned there, getting it out of that tool in a way that can be consumed and ingested easily by the consumer. And I would say regulatory, FDA would be a big customer or consumer to ingest that. So you got to look at that end of it too. So not just the generation of it, But then how do you get that information out of there? And then, of course, the in-between is what are you doing to monitor all that? And can you show FDA that you've got these plans in place that are consistent and that are scalable, and you'll be able to continue as vulnerabilities pop up, you'll get those right away, and you'll monitor and you'll respond in the timeframes that they give you. So I hope that was a good overview and provided some a little more advice on the tooling aspects.
Yeah, and I can add on as well. Things to look out for would be like in terms of trends. I think there's going to be more, much more involvement in the tool set to support us in cybersecurity, because it is complex and it is, you know, costly to be able to provide a very thorough cybersecure submission and product and be able to maintain that. There's a lot of tools around, you know, the SBOM and post-market vulnerability, and they connect within your existing environment, existing frameworks. So you can do static cybersecurity analysis, looking for vulnerabilities, and also dynamic analysis, those type of things. But I think one thing that I'm interested in to kind of see growing is what's called platform as a service, where there's third-party components that are developed in a way that are hardened already, that you can take and leverage for the common capabilities that the software needs to support. Like, you know, user authentication, for example, cybersecurity event logging, those type of things. So I think there are providers out there that are providing medical device grade platform as a service. And I think what would be important is to look to see what their certification is. Are they HITRUST certified? Are you able to get the documentation needed to actually show to FDA that your product is indeed cyber secure? In terms of what we offer, just real quick, we have templates that satisfy all the elements that I mentioned. They're very technical templates, and they're geared towards software engineers or cybersecurity experts to actually complete the documentation. So it guides you through every aspect of it, and it's structured appropriately. And we also have training. I think Ken mentioned that there's training or webinar that FDA hosted. They archive them, so you can go back and you can see the webinars that have been put on by the FDA in the past.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. Just from the FDA side of things, yeah. So I definitely kind of like saw like a fair amount of like SPDX, SBOMs, or Cyclone DX. There's also for like containerized development. There's also a tool called SIFT that kind of produces SBOMs. So those are definitely accepted. It kind of, I guess it really depends on probably the OHD office within the FDA, you know, where your submission is being reviewed, on what the requirements are. In general, I think it's always a good idea to help the reviewer, right? So somebody is actually going to look at these things and needs to do it. I personally always, you know, an SPDX or Cyclone DX SBOM, there's viewers for these things, you know, that can visualize, you know, these large JSON files. But it's definitely a good idea to also provide a PDF, you know, that has a human readable version. Just, you know, think of the person on the other end, you know, who kind of has to deal with these things. And yeah, it's if you have the PDF, you know, you're saving the reviewer the effort of kind of, you know, using some sort of tool to kind of like, you know, transform the original SBOM file into something more readable. That being said, some of the SBOM files that I've seen in submissions are huge. I mean, they're like several megabytes in length, just like the direct and indirect dependencies of the solution. So, you know, it might not even make sense, you know, to put this into a PDF, because it's going to be like a 300-page PDF. So, but yeah, just kind of think about, you know, what the person on the other side, you know, what they would need in order to make sure, you know, that you kind of did a good job there in kind of like, you know, identifying your dependencies and vulnerabilities there.
I think that's a great tip on how to position a submission and potentially leverage eSTAR. Does anyone else have any other tips on leveraging eSTAR and what you've seen?
I'll focus a little bit. It's not necessarily eSTAR, but it goes through like the exception cases. like best practices maybe. So in the eSTAR itself, if you look through every category, there's a little question mark. And if you highlight that, it gives you some more specificity. And my recommendation would be to make sure you understand that, but then refer back to that section in the actual guidance and make sure your deliverable covers everything else in case it's not included there. So don't use the eSTAR as like a cheat sheet for following the guidance. Do the opposite, correlate the two and make sure you're covering everything. But I would say for tricky situations where, you know, you're not too sure, you have maybe a lot of justification of non-applicability for your submission or for the items in the submission, I would recommend a Q-sub. Like if you're unsure about how you're going to approach the cybersecurity, I would position it in such a way as you would in your submission, but go to the Q-sub with your positioning and kind of get the feedback there. Because the Q-sub can be done much more, it could be done earlier, it's free. But what it does, it gives you preliminary information on what they're going to be looking for and a preliminary view while you're working on the rest of your submission, right? So you can kind of do it in parallel and de-risk your submission. So when you submit, you're going to have less potential back and forth with the FDA because that's what takes the longest. The submission process, you know, and the review time is the review time. What takes the longest is the back and forth, right? So the more you can alleviate that by going earlier to the FDA and getting, you know, approval or even insight into how you're approaching it, the better. And this is just my general kind of advice when going to the Q-sub, don't come open-ended. Like don't give them an A/B. They're going to be very conservative. What you want to do is you want to say, this is the position I'm taking. Like you want to go in with the position that you want to take, right? Unless you absolutely don't know, but go in with the position that you want to take and then justify it and see how they poke holes into your strategy and then see how you can actually mitigate their response to that.
And you will still get a very non-committal response. So,
yes.
you probably kind of
yes.
can attest to that. But I mean, so they in a Q-sub they will never basically kind of pre-review. You know,
yes.
Q-sub is not a pre-review. You know,
Exactly.
they will never say like, yes, we will accept this, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's going to be worded much more carefully and saying like, yes, you know, that this will very likely kind of, you know, do it, but you know, we'll have to see the complete submission materials. So, but it's a very good idea for.
Yeah, that's a good point. They won't say yes, but if they have a concern, they will raise it. So at least you'll know what all the objections might be, and it won't be comprehensive. It's just going to give you kind of a gut check on kind of where you're at. So, and obviously, I think Marco mentioned this before, if you're not a cybersecurity expert and you have a very complex device, especially if it's a cloud device or a highly connected device, do bring in experts to help you, like technical experts to help you with the submission and with your device development, because it's not just the submission, it's also the technical stuff. I don't think I mentioned that before, but some of the gaps are actually just inherent design gaps. Right. And those take longer to implement because you have to go through the full development cycle. So when you read the guidance, there's some things that doesn't say directly, that imply certain capabilities within your device. So make sure that you implement those capabilities because that's a big gap. And those was kind of that list that I mentioned, the security controls, that's what they call it. They're design features. Right. So make sure that you have the proper design features that FDA is going to be looking for that they deem as being best practice.
Well, that's a lot of great advice. I guess what I'm wondering is there, and so maybe this question has already been answered, but is there a single piece of advice that you would say you would want to give to medical device manufacturers, you know, as they go, as they're submitting?
Gosh, I don't want to give this advice because I heard it from FDA and not in a bad way, but just I don't really like this advice because in the past, things were a little bit different, but the advice is currently from FDA is just follow the guidance. That's what they say. Just follow the guidance. Right now, unfortunately, that's the case. It's just follow the guidance. Other guidances, you have more leeway in terms of justifying why things don't apply or why you're not submitting something or how you did it differently. Right now, it seems to be very rigorous in terms of what's expected, like the threat. You could do risk analysis some other way, right? You can assess vulnerabilities another way, but they want a full threat analysis, which is a methodology. So it's interesting that it's very different than other guidances where they're actually requiring a methodology, and it is in the eSTAR. So for right now, that's my advice, but I don't like to give that because I feel like there's aspects of things that depend. Every product's very different. Right. And I think every product development process can differ and still provide value. And so that's usually my stance. But right now, I think because it's still new, just be very thorough.
I would say that's frankly, that's also kind of like, you know, on top of my list. And there's a reason, you know, if you look at the guidance documents, right? The guidance documents, they all say guidance for industry and FDA staff. And your submission is going to be evaluated by the guidance document, right? Yeah. And it is a somewhat templatized procedure, right? But it links very directly to the guidance, right? So for the software review, you know, whatever is kind of like in section 4, you know, of the software guidance, you know, whatever A through H, you know, the sub items, documentation level, software description, and so on. That's what the FDA's review process is based on, right? And kind of in line with that, it really helps when you prepare your 510(k) submission to really use the same terminology and the same document names as the FDA does in their guidance, to make it easier for the reviewers to match, right? So for instance, you know, in threat modeling, right? The cybersecurity guidance calls out threat modeling. Call it threat modeling, you know, don't call it attack vector analysis, right? It basically, and put them in the same order, right? So that when the reviewer kind of, you know, goes through this giant checklist of things, that they can very easily match, you know, the things that they need to check versus the documentation that you provided, right? But yeah, Shauna said it right. You know, it's all written in the guidance documents. So I mean, it's that's really the primary source for you know, for how, you know, how submitters should prepare their submission, and that's also how reviewers at the FDA review those submissions.
Yeah, and if your process is different because you're following, let's say, an ISO standard that uses different terminology, but it's comparable to the guidance, create like a little project plan, or put in your cybersecurity plan or something to say this equals that, right? So then to Mirko's point, they're going to go to the top level documentation first, right, within your submission. So if you clearly say, you know, we follow ISO, whatever, it's not a recognized consensus standard yet. Hopefully it becomes one, because I think it's quite rigorous. But make sure you draw the parallel so they know, okay, this equals that. I know where to find everything, because sometimes you'll get a lot of additional information requests, assuming that deficiency. When you have the documentation, it's just not easy to find. So make sure it's clean, it's easy to find, easy to follow. More is not necessarily better, right? Just because you provide more documentation doesn't mean you're more rigorous. It just allows to have more cross-referencing mistakes and inconsistency. So keep it solid, keep it simple, but do follow the guidance.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm thinking, with all of this vast experience of this panel, the entire panel, and even from a different unique perspectives, I'm curious if you all could share any case studies, or, you know, the real world examples of medical device manufacturers that have successfully navigated the submission process, and how they were able to address the cybersecurity requirements. Ken, would you mind starting on that question?
No, I don't mind at all. Yeah, so you know, the interesting thing is, you know, we've seen successful you know, attempts at submissions, and we've seen unsuccessful attempts, and you know, really the successful attempts usually have a few things in common, and I think we've just talked about them as in the final pieces of advice that we gave. But first and foremost is communication with FDA, right? And it's really important, as the source, we call it the source of truth at the device manufacturer. You know your device better than FDA knows your device. You should know the architecture of your device. You should know the safety mechanism, the security mechanisms, what you've put in place in order to protect that device, and you should be transparent about communicating that, right? And so one of the things we see are submissions that are very transparent and very easy to follow. And I think Shauna mentioned that is, if you may have that documentation in your submission, but if they have to go looking for it, it's not obvious that it follows this next step, then that's going to be a problem. So you want to make sure that you walk through it yourself, make sure you understand it very well before submitting it, and you can do that through all of the tools that are online today, and kind of practice these submissions. But that'd be first and foremost. So that communication needed to get right. And then we talked about it before a little bit. We touched on SBOM, but as part of this overall risk management plan, right? So FDA really is pushing on secure product development framework, which includes this understanding, a deeper understanding of risk management. And I think where Shauna was going before, which I hope we get there, is this kind of risk-based approach where you look at devices and the risk appropriate to that device. But for right now, everything's being treated the same. So you got to look at your risk assessment process and look at your framework and make sure you've got that set up and structured in the right way. I think those are a couple of the really big things. And as we said, SBOM falls out of that. Vulnerability monitoring, a plan to support devices as they are in the market. There's a lot of talk around legacy. And believe me, that problem is something that everybody's looking at from the perspective of how do we protect devices that are already on the market, and how do we protect them throughout their life cycle and beyond that. So knowing those things ahead of time, planning for that is something everyone should do. And I've seen more successful submissions when it's well thought through like that.
And I think a lot of these, a lot of these requirements really they cannot be done manually, right? I mean, so they require tooling and they require automation, right? And I think that is kind of very important, like from the very beginning, right? When you set up your development process, before the first commit, to kind of create like a piece of the software, that you have a development process that's fully automated, with regards to unit tests, integration tests, just on the software development side, but also with regards to, SBOM creation, vulnerability scanning. It is really something that only for very trivial devices, it is something that you can do manually without tools and without any sort of automation. And it's really something, as Shauna said earlier, these are oftentimes these are design features, right? So this is something, the awareness that there is a cybersecurity component to your device needs to be really there from day one. And that is oftentimes the tragedy, of submissions that are failing, right? Where, you kind of look at these things and it's very clear, that they try to kind of bolt on the cybersecurity afterwards. If they had involved somebody, who had the right expertise, from the very beginning of the development process, it would have been much more successful, and they would have, a successful FDA submission. So it's, so tools, automation, very important for the entire process.
Yeah, Marco, you remind me of a point. Either it's being enforced or encouraged through AI development as you integrate the AI into every aspect of your software development lifecycle. And so the same goes true with cybersecurity. It's not a separate development lifecycle. It may be spelled out separately, but it really should be integrated in your development process. So if you're upfront planning, you should be planning for cybersecurity. You're writing requirements, you should have your security requirements, right? Once you start doing your risk analysis, you should be then coupling it with your cybersecurity vulnerability analysis. So you should be doing all those things throughout the development process, because the submission is not a paper exercise, right? A lot of times we see a lot of companies, typically startups, not to call you out, but generally fully developed products with no design history file, right? And then the risk there is that you're going to have to make product changes, right? Or we're going to have to spend a lot of time justifying why we're not going to make product changes, right? And both those things are difficult to do. And so if you integrated, it also reduces the pain or the perceived burden of it, because you have everything. So then at the end, when you're submitting, it's just kind of cleaning things up and aligning eSTAR, right, and doing a final review before you submit, making sure it's accurate and accurately represents the software. But if you've been doing it throughout, it's not a heavy lift, right? It will burden the development team. I'm not going to deny that, but it's not going to be this heavy lift at the end or this huge oversight. Because when you do get the feedback from FDA, you have about, what is it, Mirko? Is it at 180 days or something like that to respond or to address?
Yeah, 180 days, yeah.
Yeah. And so if you're not able to remediate your product in that time frame, you have to start the process all over again. Right. So that's just kind of my advice would be going back and making sure you have an integrated process for cybersecurity. So it's not an afterthought or a side thing. Even if you feel your product is lower risk, I would still recommend integrating it into your development life cycle.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end. So and we have so many great questions. So I'd like to let the audience know that we're going to do our best to circle back with this group and maybe send a follow-up with as many answers to your questions as we possibly can address. But I'm going to pick one because I know this was discussed not that long ago. And I'm going to skip our last question and just choose this one. And I'm going to address it to you, Shauna, to start with. And it's, can you talk about legacy devices in the context of cybersecurity, how to remediate them and ensure they're in compliance with these requirements? If you don't mind starting, or
this is a big one. So what I do want to comment on is after the webinar, we can send a list of all the standards we kind of mumbled through where we don't memorize the numbers. So here's another one. So this is IMDRF and it's legacy device. So they published I'm not sure if it's a guidance, what it's actually classified as, but it's a working group. And they're looking at some aspects of how to manage the legacy device. And it's very well done. And it's focused on the post-market process, right? So legacy device, I think the definition is going to be in negotiation, because right now the definition is that the device cannot be up to date to maintain the cybersecurity or to meet the cybersecurity expectations related to post-market surveillance, right? It just can't. So that's kind of the current definition. But when you start looking at it, what's I think really important for medical device manufacturers, if you have legacy devices out in the field, is to start with a baseline. Do pen testing, go and do a threat model, right? Look at the potential vulnerabilities, create your SBOM, look at the vulnerabilities there and see how vulnerable your product is. And at that point, when you look at it from that lens, that's, business accountability to decide what you need to do based on the level of vulnerabilities in your system. Right? You might be surprised on what you find, or you might be very pleased at what you find, but that would be my first recommendation, is just to baseline it with those, key things, the penetration testing, the threat model, which obviously goes into the risk analysis as input, and then the vulnerability assessment of all your third-party components. Once you do that, I think it's important to decide based on the vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities you discovered, how to communicate to your customers. Tell them to say, hey, these are some known vulnerabilities. Here's how to protect, and this is what we're doing about it, right? Because you want to enable the healthcare providers or your other customers in other areas, not just healthcare professionals, but also patient users, to be able to rely on the product, right? And so I think providing them that transparency is going to be really important. Making determination whether there's a recall. There's quite a few out there now. There's about, they're not tracked separately, but if you do research and you just search cybersecurity recalls, there's about maybe 40 of them. A lot of big players there making recalls, class 2 and class 3 recalls. So that's also an option there. And the recall for class 1, class 2 is communication, and then some patching updates or some sort of field action. And then updating your product, getting it to where it needs to be if possible, so that you can do post-market surveillance on your product from a cybersecurity perspective. I know we're out of time, but there's one last point, and the last point is end of lifing. So, I mean, that is a consideration, is issuing end of service to say we're no longer going to be servicing this product, and then ultimately leading that up into end of life, and then replacing it with a newer technology that has the capability.
Excellent. Shauna, thank you so much for that final answer. And Ken, did you have something to add there?
No, just to say thank you to both Shauna and Mirko for a great session and great discussion. Hopefully that was helpful. Excellent. Yes, I'd like to thank the entire panel for your participation, another tongue twister, today. It was really great informative information. And I'd also like to thank our audience for taking the time to join us. We'll be coming out with some more interesting topics, and we'll circle back with you with some answers to your questions and more resources. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.